With one of the latest optimization patches for Tarkov, 0.16.1.2, we got a new graphics option, which is the ability to disable volumetric lighting in the graphics settings. Now, I won't dwell on this too much, since many of you have likely heard about it or seen it in action already. However, it got me thinking about Tarkov's flashlights and how they function. Many of us have just kind of gotten used to how they work at this point, but I think we can all agree that being able to turn off volumetric lighting and slap 5 flashlights on a gun to roleplay the sun is a bit much. In the most recent patch that we got this last Friday, 0.16.1.3, they allegedly optimized the technology of flashlight and lamp illumination rendering, quote unquote, but this does not appear to have done anything for the balancing of the flashlights after the volumetric lighting option was implemented. Because volumetric lighting helps balance the flashlights by introducing fog, which makes it harder to see if you overuse flashlights. But now, with this setting disabled, even a single flashlight gains a noticeable advantage, and the effect becomes even more absurd when stacking multiple lights. There also seems to be a slight advantage to having volumetric lighting off when being on the receiving end of a flashlight, as the blinding effect seems to be slightly milder and the aura around the light is less white and easier to see past. This advantage seems to also be there for up to 5 flashlights, which means there is even more reason to turn off volumetric lighting. Another interesting thing is that flashlights are somewhat usable with NVGs now, as turning off the volumetric lighting makes it significantly easier to see while using a flashlight and NVGs at the same time. So that makes it sort of possible to actually combine the two now. You still get blinded just as much while using NVGs on the receiving end of a flashlight though, regardless of whether volumetric lighting is off or on, so that stays the same. I can also hear some of you say, but turning volumetric lighting off makes the game darker and harder to see. Well, I have just the thing for you. It's called a gamma slider, and you're gonna fucking love it. Because the gamma slider takes care of the only real reason to keep volumetric lighting on at this point, which is that it allegedly brightens some of the darker areas of the maps. But to be honest, while testing it myself, there was no noticeable difference in the dark areas. Maybe that's because my gamma is turned up a bit already at 1.6, so it is possible that others might see a difference here even though I didn't. Unless you want to keep it on for immersion. This effectively removes any downside to using flashlights, making them even more powerful. While there is still some reflections on shiny surfaces, which can be annoying, especially with 5 flashlights on, in open areas or hallways, you can see perfectly fine, even with 5 flashlights, without fog affecting you, and only some minor glare on perpendicular surfaces or brightly colored surfaces. It does make little sense for your own flashlights to blind you, so I would personally consider this a good change overall, as this is how flashlights should look in my opinion. However, flashlights might need a little bit of tweaking as a result of this change. So if this is how flashlights should look, what adjustments, if any, should we make? Because flashlights should remain a valuable, useful tool in Tarkov, right? Investing rubles into a flashlight and risking losing it in a raid for the advantage it brings is core to the idea of gear and equipment mattering. They also contribute to the game's skill ceiling and serve purposes beyond just blinding opponents. You can bait for shots and info by sticking your gun around a corner with the flashlight on, or doing it with blind fire. You can throw off enemies by toggling the flashlight between peaks to throw off your opponent's expectations. If you're in a fight and you have peeked with your flashlight on, you can all of a sudden toggle it off before your next peek, while maybe also shifting your timing a little bit, then swing on your opponent without a flashlight. Or the other way around. Fight without a flashlight, then all of a sudden you swing with your flashlight on. Great way to use an enemy's expectations against them. They can also be used to blind NVG users in night raids, so even if you have NVGs yourself, it can be a point to bring a flashlight to nighttime raids. Because if you get into a fight at night and you know the other guy likely has NVGs as well, you can flip up yours and take the fight with a flashlight instead, and the NVG wearing enemy won't see shit. You can also counter someone with a flashlight. So if someone peeks a corner with their flashlight on, I can simply look at the floor and pre-fire the moment their light hits me. These are obviously relatively basic plays, but they add to the overall skill ceiling in the game, which is almost always a good thing. Flashlights should have their place in Tarkov because they add depth to gameplay and skill expression, just like lasers do or anything else. Speaking of which, people really need to learn to toggle their lasers off. I can't count how many times I've avoided death because someone was holding an angle with their laser on. You know what? Lasers are great, guys. Keep using them. Toggling them off, completely overrated. Now, the main issue people seem to have with flashlights is that they remain blinding even in outdoor daylight. In real life, a flashlight's blinding effect depends on range, the lumens, which is the total light output, and the candela, which is the actual beam intensity of the flashlight. And the candela seems to be the deciding parameter for how blinding a flashlight is. When doing some research, apparently, it seems like people don't really use flashlights during the day very much, imagine that. So I haven't really had that much information to go off of, but it does seem like you would need a candela of around or more than 1 megacandela for a flashlight to be blinding at closer ranges in real life during daylight. This also seems to push its definition towards a floodlight rather than a flashlight as well, though, so keep that in mind. So a tactical flashlight doesn't seem to be particularly blinding in daylight unless you're at very close range. So if we take an example, the Predator XHP35 flashlight from Tarkov outputs 1700 lumens with a candela of 50,750, which is powerful at night, but not necessarily very overwhelming during the day at all. And a far cry from the 1 million or 1 mega candela we would need to be considered blinding during daytime. So if Tarkov aims for realism, it would make sense to nerf flashlights during daytime. But realism alone doesn't always translate to good gameplay design, as we all know. And even if it did, it might be difficult to simulate in a game. The real issue is that daylight isn't a single universal condition. What if it's high noon in an open field? A flashlight probably shouldn't be blinding in that scenario. But what about dusk or dawn? A flashlight should arguably have some effect as the total amount of ambient light is way lower. What about dimly lit interiors during daytime? Well, a flashlight should obviously still be useful in that case. And all of these can exist in the same daytime raid. So for true realism, the flashlight's blinding effect would need to dynamically adjust based on the lighting conditions. But implementing this likely sounds a lot easier to do than it actually is. If BSG tried to make flashlights work differently indoors than outdoors during a daytime raid, would a flashlight suddenly become 3 times brighter and more blinding the moment you step inside? What about using a flashlight into a building or out of one? It's probably not so straightforward to magically make flashlights worse in daylight while having them retain their usefulness in all the other use cases that could occur during a daytime raid. I imagine that making a system that could accommodate this realism would mean simulating real eye adaptation to light and dark in the game engine, and then having that interplay with ambient and other lighting correctly, as well as flashlights. And dude, that 3-way is a bug-filled shit show waiting to happen. And it would probably do more harm than good putting a dynamic system like that in BSG's hands. So I can see from BSG's perspective how they might not be very motivated to chase perfection at likely a massive cost on this issue. There is also the very real possibility, and in my mind the most likely case, is that BSG doesn't care and/or feels like it's okay the way it is. People have wanted flashlights nerfed forever. It might be a loud minority, but regardless, BSG, while adjusting flashlights in earlier patches, seem to have found where they want to be, as they haven't changed flashlights for the last several wipes now, I believe. And if they've made their mind up, there isn't really a lot to do, as BSG isn't known for listening to player feedback, and at some point might just be something to accept. So it seems likely to me that BSG hasn't changed flashlights because they may either believe the balancing is fine, or they simply don't want to risk breaking the game more by implementing a complex system that could actually do them justice. But let's assume that BSG are open to tweaking flashlights. How could they do that? The simplest and most straightforward fix is obviously just reduce the flashlight brightness slightly. I would maybe say like 10-15%. This would be a small nerf that would tone them down a little bit without making them useless. Alternatively, this reduction could be tied to sunglasses, for example, which is an idea that has been thrown around a lot, and it would be an interesting case for actually using sunglasses or tinted tactical glasses and have them actually serve a purpose in the game, as well as add an extra level of preparedness to the game, while still allowing flashlights to be powerful and relevant. Another thing that they could do is to make flashlights overall have a slightly smaller part of the cone actually be blinding, with a more gradual fall off to the sides, meaning the blinding effect is more sensitive to whether you are aiming directly in someone's face or not. This is already kind of a thing, but these parameters could be adjusted to make the most effective part of the flashlight cone smaller, basically. So you would need to be more precise with where you point your flashlight to get the maximum blinding effect. They could also adjust the cone fall off to be more gradual, so that you would more gradually be able to see past the blinding light at the edges of the beam. Basically just changing the existing flashlight parameters so that they would remain powerful if used skillfully, but they would be harder to use skillfully, and more dependent on you being able to keep them on your target. This is probably my ideal fix for flashlights, as I really enjoy there being a skillful aspect to them and enjoy them being powerful, and this would complement that, while at the same time being a slight nerf. The obvious fix, to me at least, to the whole sun problem of stacking 5 or so flashlights is to make multiple flashlights have a diminishing return on their effect after a certain point. So let's say that 150% effect is the max that you could achieve regardless of flashlight count, with a baseline flashlight effect of 100%. Flashlights are obviously a little bit different each. One might be a bit brighter with a smaller cone, one might be dimmer but wider. But if I were to slap 2 of these flashlights on my gun, then they would each individually have an effect of 75% instead of their original 100%, equaling 150%. If I were to put 3 on the gun, they would each have a 50% effect each. If I were to put 5 flashlights on my gun, each flashlight would have a 30% effect. This way, flashlight type would still matter, so 2 flashlights with a narrow cone and a high blinding effect would be slightly better at blinding enemies than 2 flashlights with a wide cone and less brightness. But you wouldn't be able to push it to these ridiculous levels as you can do currently. This would be like hooking up 2 lights on the same battery in a series. So the battery now has to split its voltage between the 2 lights, meaning they are now going to be dimmer. I think that's a good way to explain it, even though in reality you would just connect them in parallel instead and not have this problem at all, most likely. But yeah. I also think the flashlight effect should add up with how they work currently, so 2 flashlights at 75% effect each should still equal 3 flashlights at 50% each in terms of how it would look in the game, as the recipient or the lightee, I guess. So I don't think they would need to make any changes there in the game engine to make that work. I also think there should be some advantage to going 2 flashlights over 1, as it is more of an investment, but 150% seems more than good enough to be the max out point. I'm also not saying exactly this is what the numbers should be. This is just an example of how BSG could remove the absurdity from flashlights and balance them at least from being completely broken. It could also be more progressive, right? So that 2 flashlights have a max of 120% effect, 3 flashlights have a 135% max, 4 flashlights have 145% max, and 5 flashlights you gain the full 150% max effect, and then it just plateaus after that. So it's like a hard cap at 150%. So you wouldn't just cap out at 2 flashlights, you could take more flashlights and actually get a marginal difference should you want to invest the rubles to do so. Implementing some kind of diminishing return for flashlights seems to me like the probably best fix for the flashlight abuse. Exactly how they best could do that, I don't claim to know. So if you have a good idea that you think is better than mine, then let me know in the comments below. But yeah, I would say that this diminishing return is probably, along with some of the other changes I suggested, the best way to balance flashlights currently. This is obviously just my take on the situation and just my thoughts. I'm very curious what you guys think about this topic, and if someone has a solution that is better and that I haven't been able to think of for myself about what should be done with the flashlights. Maybe you like flashlights the way they work currently. Maybe you, like me, think they could be brought down a little bit. Maybe you just want them gone entirely. I don't know. Let me know your opinion, and let's get some constructive discussion going. And I will talk to you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching. Take care.